Thanks, Julian. Thanks everyone for being here. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Della. So the donut provides an overview of California's social and ecological performance, and we really hope that this snapshot can serve as a compass to help orient us towards meeting the needs of all people within the limits of the planet. And here you can see a little bit overview of our findings, and we're falling short on 100% of the social indicators we measured and overshooting on 89% of the ecological indicators, with the average social shortfall being 34% and the average ecological overshoot at 283%. In the next few slides, we'll dig deeper into what this visualization represents. And now I want to talk a little bit about how we collected these indicators and also assessed shortfall and overshoot. You can go ahead to the next slide. So Julian talks a little bit about our process. Really began with this review of previous donut reports, combining existing social and ecological indicators for the state of California. And we considered over 200 indicators and selected around 100 as potential fits for the 20 or so categories that are generally included in donut assessments. And Julian talked a little bit as well about how we collaborated with experts from the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, with regional experts, with local academic, governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, and community groups to help us narrow down and improve the list. And in the end, we have the social foundation made up of 24 indicators divided between 12 categories, while the ecological ceiling consists of 18 indicators divided into 9 categories. And many of these indicators appear in other donut reports or in other assessments, but others are specific to the California context. And around 50% are documented by government agencies, 30% by NGOs, and 20% by academic reports or peer-reviewed articles. And with that, let's dig a little bit into the data. We can go ahead and go to the next slide and also click twice to reveal the final social and ecological indicators in spreadsheet form rather than in the beautiful graphic form. Some people like to see it as a table or to see the way it can look as a table. And here we can see how each indicator has both a current estimate, a desirable target, and these two are then combined to assess the level of overshoot. And many of you maybe already know, outside of the donut framework, it's quite common to have data points that are not linked to a desirable target. And that can make it really difficult, our job at the research end, to assess overshoot and shortfall. And we tried to use aspirational targets that align with science, and also what we hear from groups who are working on these issues in California. And I think it's been mentioned already, but we do consider this a living document and hope to include updates based on feedback in the future. And this goes for both the targets and the indicators themselves. And you could make the argument that some of our targets are too aspirational, maybe almost impossible to achieve, especially on the social side, where we generally aim for 100% or 0%. And we don't really see that as a weakness. Rather, it fits with this idea of the donut as a compass. While a compass points north, the reason we have a compass is not to take us to some place called north, but rather to orient us in the right direction. And we'll talk a little more how this manifests itself later in the presentation. And for now, we can go ahead to the next slide. Here we zoom in on the ecological ceiling, back to the graphic form, and we see a few words which describe each indicator to go along with the general level of overshoot. And we can see here, for example, that the category climate change is made up of 2 indicators, greenhouse gas emissions and renewable electricity. These are abbreviations, and the full indicators, they appeared in the table you saw a moment ago, and they'll also appear in the donut unrolled visualizations, which we will explore shortly. During this research, I found there was really a lack of information related to consumption-based environmental indicators for states like California. We've talked about how it's a large, wealthy state with many decisions made at the state level, so this seems like quite a gap in the literature and necessary to inform policy. Producing new indicators is beyond the scope of this report, which really seeks to compile existing information, existing indicators, but this is something we would like to explore more in the future, along with a time series. So providing, rather than just one point in time estimate, rather seeing how this picture has changed over time. With that, we can go ahead to the next slide. And we can click twice to reveal the local aspirations and planetary boundaries. Some of you may be familiar with this 4-lens approach, which considers 2 sides of the ecological coin. So basically, how is our society matching nature's generosity? This is sometimes called our local aspirations. And then how is society impacting nature globally through our consumption patterns? This is referred to usually as the planetary boundaries. And we considered having two donuts, one with global indicators and one with local indicators. And in the end, we decided to combine both into one donut, which has, of course, strengths and weaknesses. Often the easier something is to understand at first glance, the more of the intricacies are lost. But we tried to find a balance here of being easy to understand while also presenting enough information to make it meaningful. Here you can also see the year the indicator was assessed. We tried to use the most recent indicators available, but in some cases we thought it's important to include an indicator even if it's not measured in the most recent calendar year, or if it's not being measured on a yearly basis, particularly on the ecological side. And we hope that the report can encourage governments or other organizations to consider tracking these indicators that we see as vital to our future. And given the state of the information, there's often this trade-off between having the best indicator to capture a topic and then having an indicator that is being assessed yearly. So we tried to again, strike the balance there. We can go ahead to the next slide. And now we see the donut unrolled, the next layer of complexity in graphic form. So now we see the percent overshoot expressed numerically, the full name of the indicator. I would say this is probably the best place to look for hotspots or discern patterns or maybe spot discrepancies between two indicators in one category. And we can see now that greenhouse gas emissions, for example, is measured per capita. It's consumption-based perspective, and we're over 1,000% over the safe limit. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. You can also see that renewable electricity is measuring the percent of electricity from non-renewable sources. And we're really using this gold standard of solar, wind, and geothermal as renewable sources. And as with all the indicators, this is a compromise. We could have included hydropower, biomass, and nuclear as renewables, as the state of California generally does, and the overshoot would then be lower. But what if we had considered all energy from renewables rather than just electricity? Electricity is this small portion of total energy use, then the overshoot would have been far higher. I think this point highlights that there's a lot behind these numbers, and we try to get into that a little more in these section reports. And we're planning to have one section report for each category to dive deeper into the nuances that are not captured in these numbers. That's forthcoming, so you can look for that in the next couple months. It's not in part of this current report, but we do have a preview here if you go to the next slide to show you what one of those section reports might look like. Diving into climate change, you could imagine this as the next layer of complexity. So you see the actual data point for California along with the unit of measurement, 12.1 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per capita per year, per person per year, excuse me. And you also see the desirable target, which is used to calculate the level of overshoot, in this case, 1 ton per person per year. And the target here is based on downscaling the planetary boundaries framework to a per capita level that's in line with the 1.5 to 2 degree limit codified in the Paris climate agreements. In these reports, we include some information related to each category, or rather, we include some indicators for each category that didn't make the final cut. We have these two representative indicators, but I mentioned we considered quite a few more indicators. So we mentioned some of those here, and we also try to provide some context and background and mention some of the most important policies related to this issue, and also note how things are changing over time. Even though we could provide a full time series for all the indicators, we try to capture that here to some extent. And finally, we highlight inequalities, both within the state and between countries, to understand how power and justice impact these challenges. Here's an example of that. You can see the map on the bottom left, where it's showing how carbon footprint changes depending on what neighborhood you're in San Francisco, predictably wealthier neighborhoods being responsible for most emissions. Meanwhile, countries and locations with the least emissions will be hardest hit by climate change. And thanks to our partners over at the Cool Climate Lab for both producing this map and also reviewing this section for us. Now on to the social foundations. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Julian mentioned how this is where we can see the biggest discrepancy between the national donuts that appear on the Good Life for All website. And he mentioned how their research is compiling data from most nations for a range of social and ecological indicators. And because of that, they use thresholds that are applicable to most nations. And it's hard for them to accurately capture this local context, as Julian exemplified with poverty line. Here we use a poverty line that's more in line with the context of California, and predictably that leads to more shortfall. And I think Julian mentioned that shouldn't be taken to mean California is performing below the US average. Rather, we used more aspirational targets applicable to the local context. Go ahead to the next slide. The donut lenses approach can also be applied to the social foundation. So on one hand, we can think about how is our society meeting the needs of people within California, the social thresholds. And then on the other hand, how is our society impacting people around the world through our consumption patterns? This is sometimes referred to as our global responsibilities. I found that the global social indicators were probably the most difficult to measure, at least quantitatively, compared to any other category. Least researched in the Doughnut framework and also beyond the Doughnut framework in the academic literature. And there are some interesting studies looking at measures of appropriated wealth, labor, land, energy, and materials between nations, but none of that has been extended to the state level. Some other donut reports have taken a more qualitative approach, looking at stories. And you can imagine, for example, how companies, practices, California companies like Apple, if you click, you can reveal Apple, and click one more time to reveal Tesla. You can think about how these companies treat workers in their factories and along their supply chains around the world. Or you can think about bank investments, California banks, and how their practices might impact climate change and local communities in the US and also abroad. If you click one more time, you could also think about how US military interventions are impacting people in other countries. A lot of the bombs from there are being made in California, and how that's impacting our global responsibilities and people's lives in other countries. So we didn't include any global social indicators in this report, but I think it's a priority for future reports to try to capture these global responsibilities in addition to the time series assessment that I mentioned. And I'll finish off by talking a little bit about the social foundation unrolled. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Now we can see the percent shortfall and the full indicator names. And before I pass it over to Stephanie to zoom in on each one of these categories, I wanted to mention one more time about our choice to use aspirational targets of 100%. In the global national donuts that we keep mentioning, they use the social target of 95% often. And in that case, you can see the 2% over here on the far right. That's 2% of people who receive their water from systems that do not meet water quality standards. If we use the 95% rather than the 100%, they would not be considered in shortfall. There would not be considered to be a shortfall there, but there's more than 1 million Californians who are represented by that 2% and who are receiving their water from these faulty systems. So again, a sort of compromise, but hopefully this makes it clear why we chose to use the aspirational targets, even if it's almost practically impossible to achieve that 100% are reaching this goal. And with that, I'll pass it over to Stephanie, who will now take some time to walk us through how California is performing in each category and for each indicator.